Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Kabiz Ranavardi. I'm the co-president of ColumbiaDC and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, let me welcome members of the Harvard Club of Washington, D.C., as well as our CAA partners in New Jersey for joining us this evening. We are very honored and privileged to have Professor Nancy Rosenblum of Harvard University with us tonight to discuss the unsettling and timely topic of conspiracism and its effects on the American democracy. Please allow me to briefly introduce our speaker, but I do encourage everyone to check our website for her full bio. Nancy Rosenblum is the Harvard University Senator Joseph Clark Professor of Ethics in Politics and Government Emerita. Her field of research is historical and contemporary political thought. She is the author, among other books, of Membership and Morals, The Personal Uses of Pluralism in America in 1998. Professor Rosenblum is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science. She is past president of the American Society for Political and Legal Philosophy, past vice president of the American Political Science Association, and a past board member of the Russell Sage Foundation. She is co-editor of the Annual Review of Political Science, and she served as chair of the Department of Government from 2004 to 2011. So without further ado, Professor, please take it away.
There we go. Something happens and we're startled into thought. And the moment came the day after President Trump's inauguration, when the National Park Service published photographs of the event. Trump had made grandiose claims that his was the biggest crowd ever, bigger than Obama's. And when the photos showed a modest number of celebrants, he claimed that the photographs were doctored. This was a conspiracy charge against unnamed civil servants in the National Park Service. They were plotting to undermine him. And his press secretary repeated the absurdity. Well, this was my first experience of sheer disorientation. Maybe you've shared it. Doctored photographs insulted our common sense. It assaulted our understanding of reality. And we're disoriented not only because conspiracists are wildly misinformed or indifferent to the facts or lack a capacity for correction. All of that's true. We're disoriented more profoundly because they reject a shared notion of what it means to know something, what it means to know that the inaugural crowd was the biggest in history, or the Democrats engineered the deadly conflict between white nationalists and protesters in 2017. As one baffled investigator said of the assertion that Ukraine, not Russia, interfered in the American election, it doesn't connect with anything in my experience. I don't know how to get to this point. Well, for 5 years, conspiracism has enveloped and shaped American political life, and every day has brought distress and disorientation. People went to psychiatrists, and psychiatrists went to their psychiatrists. We suffered a national reality disorder. And so I'm grateful to Kabiz Ranavardi and to the Columbia and Harvard Alumni Associations for this invitation to talk with you about what it has meant to have a president with a compromised sense of reality and the capacity to impose it on the nation. Someone who conjures conspiracies from the flotsam and jetsam of social media and foreign propaganda, who's impelled by a need to own reality, and who has the capacity to derange the nation. A president abetted by craven or cynical elected officials and large numbers of our fellow citizens who submit to his attempt to own reality. Well, two events, of course, have amplified conspiracism's destruction: the stolen election of 2020 and COVID-19. This year, the claim to own reality was fatal. Mounting viral deaths amounted, I think, to presidential killing, and conspiracism led to violent political sedition. The virus and elections aftermath explain what should be the question mark in my title: does reality bite? I'm no poet, But when I got this invitation, I had hoped to strike a note of emotion reflected in tranquility, but that's become impossible. So I'm going to wend my way toward answering the question, does reality bite? I'm going to begin by talking about the unique form that conspiracism takes today. And then I'll talk about its very successful assault on foundational democratic institutions. I'll focus next on the 2020 election and COVID. And I'll end by ruminating out loud about whether and how and who can help us reclaim reality. Well, let's look first at classic conspiracy theory and compare the deviant form of conspiracism that we have today. It's conspiracy without the theory. We think of the two terms conspiracy and theory linked, but they've become decoupled. Here's what I mean. Conspiracy theory is an explanation like any other, sometimes warranted, sometimes not, sometimes coming from the political right, sometimes from the left, sometimes from both, the left and the right. They compete against official accounts. Think of explanations of the assassination of JFK. Conspiracy theory works by amassing evidence and argument to persuade us that things are not as they seem. An array of dots are seen to form a pattern, and this pattern reveals the hidden power of covert forces that have malignant intent. The United States was actually born of a conspiracy theory. And if you read the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, you're familiar with this classic form. We cite the Declaration for its aspirational, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But the truth of the British plot to enslave America was not self-evident. The evidence had to be scrupulously assembled, and the authors of the Declaration produced a list of actions taken by the king's ministers and the colonial governors. And these grievances were the dots that once connected formed a pattern, adding up, in John Locke's famous phrase, to a long train of abuses, all tending the same way, to reduce the colonies to absolute despotism. As my Harvard colleague put it, a tiny tax on tea is never a tiny tax on tea, but the opening wedge of tyranny. So the Declaration was a conspiracy theory, a coherent though contestable explanation of sinister events. And it contains a political theory. This is vital because to identify the danger, we have to understand what is threatened. We need a conception of liberty or law or just institutions. The revolutionaries advocated a republic, which is why, as Tom Paine argued in his wonderful pamphlet, Common Sense, the Declaration doesn't direct Americans to seek a redress of grievances or reconciliation, but to dissolve the bonds that connected them to Britain by armed resistance and to declare themselves independent states. So this is it. Determined to make power legible, conspiracy theorists then and today reason and persuade in recognizable ways. They mimic researchers. They studiously gather evidence. They offer proofs. They publish their results. And once all the facts, especially all the facts omitted from official reports and ominously withheld by reliable sources, and bits of information that only they recognize as key to the real story, once all of this is amassed, a pattern of machination emerges. The true course of power is revealed. And this is why one wag said, not without justice, that social science just is conspiracy theory. Today, however, we have conspiracy without the theory. It also insists that things are not as they seem, but it dispenses altogether with the burden of explanation. There's no amassing of evidence, no signs that reveal a pattern, no argument, no interpretation, rigged. Just one word suffices to charge that an election was massively manipulated without any show of irregularity, not one report of a fraudulent voter impersonating a registered voter. Yet rig was offered to account for the president's loss of the New Hampshire primary and the popular vote in 2016. Trump cast the outcome of the 2018 midterm elections as a conspiracy as well, and the 2020 election was declared rigged before it even started. Thousands of the president's lies have come and gone, fact-checked or filed away or faded away, ephemera scattered by the next fresh blast of lies. Machiavelli, political theorist I've always read and taught us how to lie well so that we can be taken to be telling the truth. Trump doesn't care that his lies are easily disproved. He's indifferent because the point is the power to impose his own compromised sense of reality on the nation, and assent is a matter of submission. And unlike the floods of lies, rigged and other conspiracy charges he adopted from conspiracy entrepreneurs or concocted with his allies, they enjoy a very long life. Why? If they don't use evidence and argument, what gives conspiracy without the theory its force? Three things, I think. First of all, form matters. Bare assertion without rudimentary evidence or argument is easy to communicate, even in 280 characters on Twitter, like hoax or witch hunt. In May 2000, Trump tweeted, "Obamagate." Something terrible was going on, but what? A reporter inquired, and Trump answered, "It's been going on for a very long time. You know what the crime is. The crime is very obvious to everybody. It's the greatest political scandal in the history of the US. We don't know what Obamagate was." Bare assertion has another appeal besides its simplicity. It provides followers with the immediate gratification of performative aggression, lashing out at a pitch to harm or destroy. Indeed, the more unfathomable the accusation, the greater the distress and disorientation it provokes, the more satisfying it is. Like the stomach-turning charge that the grieving parents of kindergarteners killed in the Sandy Hook school massacre are crisis actors hired to promote gun control. The ordinary rhythms of democratic politics don't offer this kind of emotional release, and neither does complex conspiracy theory. The second feature of conspiracy without the theory is this: what validates the claim is not argument, but repetition. Asked whether Muslim communities were operating military camps to prepare for terrorist raids, and notwithstanding the absence of even an iota of confirmation, Trump repeated, "You know, a lot of people are saying that, and a lot of people are saying that bad things are happening out there." Asked whether George Soros was secretly funding the caravan of migrants approaching the US border, Trump repeated what became his mantra: "I wouldn't be surprised. A lot of people say yes." We can't verify the fantastic, but social media and data tracking cable news viewers can verify that a lot of people are saying that there's something going on out there. There's a third important characteristic of conspiracy without the theory. People who like and post and tweet and retweet don't have to believe the particulars of a conspiracy charge. I don't think that belief is the best way of looking at all of this. It's neither a matter of believing the fact of the matter, nor of repeating it while believing that it's false. It's true enough. It might have been that Obama's FBI tapped phones in Trump Tower. Bare assertion suffices, because what matters is that the hostile intent and the capacity to commit the subterfuge were there. Behind it is the logic. Even if it's not totally true, there's something there. There's one disturbing example that stands out for me. When asked to explain Trump's tweet of a video that falsely purported to show a Muslim migrant committing an assault, Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders offered, "Whether it's a real video, the threat is real." What we see is that conspiracism makes sense of things, but not by way of explanation. It makes sense for people for whom the charge of a malevolent scheme fits with the affinities and hostilities that comprise their political worldview. And finally, there's this difference. Conspiracy theory always begins with something in the world that needs to be explained, like the destruction of the World Trade Center. Conspiracism does not. You've probably heard of the conspiracy Pizzagate that says that Hillary Clinton heads a child trafficking and pedophilia ring operating out of the basement of Comet Ping Pong Pizza near Washington, D.C. Well, the charge of Clinton's sex trafficking ring is total fabulation. There's no actual event to be explained. No buses of children arriving at Comet Ping Pong, no screams, no coming and going of predators at night. There isn't even a basement. Assent to Pizzagate affirms the view that Hillary Clinton does unthinkably bad things and lies about them. Remember, she was already considered to be a double murderer of Vince Foster and Seth Fitch. She's not a political opponent, but as conspiracy entrepreneur Alex Jones put it, she's a psychopathic demon from hell. The child trafficking charge is true enough. And so is rigged. These characteristics of conspiracy without the theory help us understand our own distress and disorientation. We're living in a world of epistemic polarization, meaning polarization over how we know what we know, over what it means to know something. Conspiracists don't reveal how they know what they know. They award themselves the status of cognoscente. Like the followers of QAnon, They know that things are not as they seem. They see the nefarious course of things left unchecked. They understand that accidents are planned, democracy is a sham, all faces are masks, all flags are false. And this divide over what it means to know something fractures the political world. It's a chasm no translation can bridge. It makes it impossible to analyze, argue, persuade, negotiate. It even makes it impossible to disagree. Conspiracism makes democratic politics impossible. But it does aggravate furious political division. Tweeting, posting, liking, and sharing conspiracy claims are a way to signal political identification. Repeating a conspiracy chart is a signature that we've joined a collective we. It's an expression of political identity. And conspiracists think of repeating these bare assertions as a sort of political participation. But it's a perverse form of participation. It's unorganized, uncoordinated, lacking the common political purpose and collective action of democratic agency. And there's a reason for this. I want to underscore this point. Conspiracism today lacks not only theory as an explanation, but also substantive political theory. It lacks ideology or philosophy or a positive program or a plan of action. Classic conspiracy theory always had an ounce of utopianism, as the Declaration of Independence illustrates. Expose the plot and save the country or the world. And for that, again, we need some notion of what a saved or revolutionized or apocalyptically cleansed world would look like. Conspiracism is absurd, both because fabulations defy common sense and because it lacks political and moral gravitas. What I'm saying here is the conspiracism today is potently destructive, and I'll go on to show why, but it's politically sterile. It cannot create, rebuild, or reform, only destroy. Conspiracy without the theory devours conservatism and everything else. It's antithetical to any ideology. It's destructive of any consistent program. It undercuts every agenda. It's unfaithful to political alliances. Not even Trump's attempted coup had a plan or plot or calculation of consequences. Conspiracist charges are D all the way down, disorienting, destabilizing, degrading, deconstructing, and finally delegitimating. There is nowhere sheer conspiracist assertions like the deep state can't go. It goes to doctored inaugural photographs. But conspiracy does special damage to the legitimacy of the two foundational institutions that make democracy work. One is knowledge-producing institutions, and the other is the notion of political opposition. And because these knowledge-producing institutions and acceptance of political parties and opposition, because these are the very institutions that bring pluralism and diversity into political life, they have to be delegitimated by those who claim to own reality and who brook no contradiction. Before I show what's happened, I want to pause on this word delegitimation, which I'm going to use. But the term is used all the time and usually promiscuously. What is delegitimation exactly? It's not the equivalent of opposing or discrediting or sowing doubt or mistrust. After all, government often fails to keep promises or to enforce laws fairly or to fight corruption. It squanders our trust, and the result is mistrust. But mistrust is not the story here. To delegitimate a democratic institution is to drain it of meaning, value, and authority so that it no longer has a claim to consent or even to compliance. And that's conspiracism's distinctive work. It sets the stage for non-compliance, violence, and political subversion. I'll say a word about each of these. The assault on knowledge-producing institutions is plain enough. Fake news manufactured by enemies of the people is a conspiracy charge. And this is when fake news is not a matter of planting seeds of doubt or skepticism or the perennial charge of liberal bias. The aim in saying something is fake news is to destroy the legitimacy of the mainstream media by casting reporters as an enemy cabal that has no claim to have a hearing, much less any authority. And fake news is just part, as you know, of a wholesale assault on knowledge-producing institutions that include government experts on health and food safety and technical advisory boards in the Federal Reserve and climate scientists and government auditors, the entire national intelligence apparatus, the CDC, the list goes on and on. And this delegitimation of knowledge-producing institutions is devastating for democracy because our assurance of being right in politics, and in fact in everything else, relies on adherence to evidence and argument and unwillingness to entertain new information as they emerge, and above all, on a capacity for self-correction. After all, facts and their meaning are fairly beyond controversy. Understanding is always provisional, but we can't dispute methods of measuring unemployment and interpreting data unless we accept that social policy does require information about unemployment. I'm going to put this simply. When plural sources of knowledge are closed down and thrust outside the arena of consideration, the essential framework we have for questioning, correction, and assurance is undone. And that's the work of those who claim to own reality. Conspiracism has a second target, and that's the defining institution of representative democracy, regulated party rivalry. And it requires accepting political opposition as legitimate. I'm going to underscore this point. Commitment to the legitimacy of political opposition is the political ethic in any democracy. And it's a very demanding ethic, actually. After all, it takes self-discipline to acknowledge that one's own party is just a part and to resist the claim to represent all real or true Americans. It's true, partisans always want a winning majority, but they don't imagine that they speak for everyone or for the whole. So again, it takes moral and political self-discipline to resist the thought that my party could or should elude the inevitable rotation in office. At rock bottom, democracy needs winners who refuse to eliminate their opponents and losers who are willing to peacefully walk away. This is what legitimate opposition means. It's not just an idea, it's a practice, acted out when office holders refrain from using their power to harass or intimidate or humiliate or jail or exile or murder the opposition, and when officials who lose elections peacefully leave. You could say that democracy depends on the losers. We see that a democratic party system requires recognizing the fact and the value of political pluralism. The delegitimation of democracy always springs from antipathy to political pluralism. It always comes with the claim that the opposition is not a loyal opposition, but a conspiracy to subvert the nation. And Trump, with the silence or active complicity of his party, took us back to a time before modern representative democracy, when political opposition was by definition a seditious cabal. Before his supporters trashed the Capitol, Trump trashed the idea of legitimate opposition every day for 4 years. And I think that these basic ideas that I've laid out allowed us to decipher the events of the past year. And I'm going to begin with the 2020 election. Several steps led to the delegitimation of opposition that made stolen election true enough. The conspiracist attack started by delegitimating opposition candidates and party leaders. Take birtherism, or the charge that Clinton was a criminal and had to be locked up. And more recently, as Trump says, people in the dark shadows, people you've never heard of, these people are pulling Biden's strings. After the delegitimation of the opposition leadership came delegitimation of the entire Democratic Party. Not because its partisans proposed a flawed understanding of the public interest, but because they conspired to use the electoral process to create an alien nation, to alter America as a Christian nation, or dilute America as a white nation, or cede sovereignty to the New World Order. And this justifies political tactics of party self-entrenchment, like disenfranchising opposition voters. These tactics are necessary if what you're doing is staving off not just loss of legislative seats, but to save the nation from a party of treason. Not even the intense polarization, partisan polarization that we've had really for decades now, prepared us for this. When Democrats in Congress didn't applaud his first State of the Union address, Trump said, "Can we call this treason? Why not? I mean, they certainly don't seem to love their country very much." In a speech before the Conservative Political Action Committee, he offered to name the members of Congress who hate their country. In 2019, he told reporters, "Democrats know the Mueller probe was all a big scam and that what they were doing was actually treason. The message is that only Republican votes should count." And then there's the final step, which came just recently. The Democratic Party, Trump said at a rally last September, is held hostage by far left activists, by angry mobs, Antifa, by deep state radicals, and I will tell you, they're so lucky that we are peaceful. Now, the treasonous opposition is cast as a violent enemy, a collection, again, I'm quoting, of anarchists, agitators, rioters, looters, left-wing hit squads. And of course, adherents of Trumpist reality began to turn to rogue violence. We know that election workers received death threats and images of nooses and were told, "You're a traitor." And of course, the latest conspiracy claim is that the factions that stormed the Capitol were infiltrated by Antifa. I want to remember with you how this dynamic of escalation played out. Trump first made the rigged election charge in 2016. Winners don't usually object to the elections that bring them to power, but Trump could not accept that he lost the popular vote. But 2020 was not a repeat performance of 2016. The conspiracy charge was the same, the election was rigged. But now Trump had the power of the presidency, the loyalty or submission of national and state parties, and a grip on political institutions. You may recall that in his phone call with Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger, he invoked 7 separate conspiracy charges. I'll name them: unregistered voters, forged signatures, altered Dominion voting machines, poll workers carting away ballots in duffel bags, stolen drop boxes, 3,000 pounds of ballots shredded and burned, ballots cast by children, and the dead. In 61 court cases, I'm sure you've heard this dozens of times, Trump's lawyers didn't even pretend to present evidence of these conspiracies because in court, fantastic claims are punishable. And so ultimately, he resorted to the usual intimidation, harassment, threats, and bullying. He said to the Georgia Secretary of State, "I only need 11,000 votes, fellas. I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break." And of course, on January 6th, before urging his supporters to attack Congress, where the Senate and House were certifying electoral college votes, he repeated over and over, "We won the election and we won it by a landslide." This is now referred to as the big lie. But I've been arguing that it took 2 big lies to incite this assault on the Capitol. The lie of a stolen election, that's true, and the lie that the opposition is an enemy. After all, if an election is riddled with fraud, and even if lawful avenues of redress fail, it's true, maybe we can't count on the next election to correct the fraud, and so we can't accept the outcome. But perhaps we can wait for the next election cycle. But if the opposition is illegitimate, an enemy of the nation, we can't wait, or we won't have a country anymore. The logic of conspiracy takes us to violence. And this stolen election conspiracy remains standard fare among Republican officials and voters, even if after the attack on the Capitol, as you know, 121 Republican members of the House of Representatives voted against accepting Arizona's electoral college slate. Senators Cruz and Hawley used the now familiar conspiracy without the theory, with its logic of repetition, to justify overturning the electoral college votes. They didn't cite a single piece of evidence, but they did use Trump's mantra. They claimed by any measure, allegations of fraud and irregularities in the 2020 election exceed any in our lifetime. But the way they buttressed this claim was to say, a lot of people are saying there was fraud, making it true enough to disrupt the electoral count. This is the evidence-free circle of conspiracism that has enveloped Republican officials under Trump. To be Trumpist, finally, is to condone sedition. And with 5 exceptions for Republican and with 5 exceptions, Republican senators did not voted against, an impeachment trial. We can ask ourselves whether we expect Republican officials to disown the 4+ year effort to own reality or to speak truth to their followers. And I'm going to come to that. But first, let's talk about COVID, because 2020 had another, this time lethal conspiracy going, and a lethal consequence, and that is a pandemic run wild. And let's see whether reality bites there. COVID shows us, I think, that sudden, dangerous, dislocating events spur a quest for safety and for meaning. How do we make sense of this highly contagious disease and the suffering it brings? And conspiracists have a way of doing both. Right at hand, they understand the virus to be the covert work of powerful agents with malignant intent. Conspiracy was Trump's absolutely first impulse as the virus struck. COVID-19 is a Chinese plot, and it also was actually just a seasonal flu that the Democrats are driving into being something much more important. It's the Democrats' new hoax. And so on cue, all the conspiracies began. Dr. Anthony Fauci is attacked as a Hillary lover out to thwart Trump's total authority. Bill Gates is accused of releasing the virus to profit from a vaccine he plans to market. Ordinary populist opposition to experts as elitist was overshadowed by the conspiracist charge that experts had nefarious intent. So CDC scientists formed a resistance unit to undercut Trump's reelection, and doctors nationwide withhold hydroxychloroquine as a cure. And to cite Trump's most loathsome charge, the death rate is being inflated by doctors who receive a $2,000 bounty for each body. It's not surprising that protesters gather at state capitals, brandishing "Don't Tread on Me" flags and reviving the defiant slogan, "Live free or die," without any irony. We hear echoes, I think, of the climate change denier who said that scientists want to take your pickup truck. They want to rebuild your house. They want to take away your hamburgers. This is what Stalin dreamed about, but never achieved. At moments, of course, Trump fitfully acknowledged the reality of this monster disease, but he always came back to insisting that the real invisible enemy is not the invisible virus at all. There is one instance where reality did bite. President Trump's conspiracism met up against the coronavirus in Tulsa on June 20th. Perhaps you'll remember that his campaign had expected the rally to draw 16,000 supporters, and an overflow crowd was arranged for a crowd that they expected to be about 80,000, even as his own public health task force warned that this was a perfect hotspot for spreading COVID. And in fact, only a little over 6,000 supporters showed up. I think the empty seats marked the limit of the willingness of even Trump's ardent supporters to accept, at least in this instance, the president's distorted reality. And you may remember that the Trump campaign required attendees to sign a waiver, absolving the campaign of legal and financial liability if the virus spread. This was an admission of the unreality of virus conspiracism. And yet, Republican officials, huddled with colleagues, hiding from domestic terrorists who were banging on the door of the Capitol, and refused to wear masks. Politics overcame their death anxiety. I call this a national reality disorder. President Biden is in his inimitable way put it much better on January 15th when he said, "What the hell is the matter with these guys?" Making sense of things, like the virus, impels us to discover the meaning of events and our experience, especially the experience of suffering. And COVID has revealed, I think, conspiracism's weakness. 420 and rising American dead and the depletion of those who have survived are tragic facts. And the felt reality of our altered everyday life motivates most citizens to reject politicization of the disease. COVID has animated not only rational self-protection, but also recognition of shared danger and common sense. This shows up in polling, and it shows up in everyday life. Consider neighbors people who are uniquely situated on the one hand to endanger us with infection, and on the other hand to offer company at a distance and the balm of ordinary reciprocity. Neighbors don't dwell on conspiracy, but on the reality of misfortune. And when we ask one another, what are you going through? This simple quotidian act has significance. How are you feeling today? It's not empty words, but it expresses empathy and admits the shared reality of pandemic. Well, where does all this leave us? Does reality bite? Our national reality disorder began in politics, and it will ultimately require politics if it's to be relegated to the fringes, but not easily. Consider what we're faced with. The election of 2020 was not a total repudiation of his presidency. Trump had the highest Republican turnout in history, and Democrats suffered down ballot losses. In short, the parties remain pretty evenly divided. We also know that 1 of 3 Americans and 74% of Republicans believe there was fraud in the election, and 140 representatives in the Republicans in the House of Representatives voted to invalidate the results of the presidential election. A January Newsweek poll found that 45% of Republican voters supported the storming of the Capitol. Trumpists have a great grip on the Republican National Committee and on state parties and on many state legislatures. And they're unchastened. As we speak, the party in Congress is engaged in a purge, attempting to overthrow Liz Cheney as House Republican Conference Chair for joining 9 other Republicans who voted for Trump's impeachment. And then there's this. Proud conspiracists are elected to Congress, most famously Marjorie Greene. She's an avowed QAnon follower who thinks that Trump is battling deep state pedophiles who worship Satan. And Greene is full of false conspiracy claims, among them that Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton are bonded together, saying that we need another school massacre in order to advance gun control. And then there's this. After his belated disavowal of violence on January 6th, the Proud Boys mocked Trump as a shill, an extraordinarily weak, a total failure. And some QAnon followers face the reality that the apocalyptic storm, the end time that would be marked by Trump's promise to stay in office and to complete their cleansing work, didn't arrive. But I don't count this as a benign return to reality. And I'm sure we can talk about more of this in the Q&A if you like. Our national reality disorder began in politics and will ultimately require politics to repair the damage. But I think that dampening conspiracism is not the work of politics alone. So let me outline 3 thoughts about reclaiming reality. The first is plain and always has been, speaking truth to conspiracy. Speaking truth to conspiracy. It won't change the minds of Trumpists who share his conspiracist mindset, or of conspiracy entrepreneurs who invent and spread these charges for profit and for influence. But it does give many people the confidence to spurn conspiracism, and it gives heart to those like me who suffer disorientation. And speaking truth is more than just giving the lie to conspiracy charges. It means exposing the moral and political depravity of conspiracists. Speaking truth entails a public taking down of these people. It is the salutary preoccupation of much of the media, and the effects are cumulative. Surveys find that there's an increase in the number of Trump voters who think Biden's win is legitimate, from 22% on November 10th to 32% on January 7th. Polls are variable. What matters most is who does the speaking, and elected Republicans are best situated to disabuse their constituents who are hardened conspiracists. They have consistently failed to do the minimum. A month after Biden's victory, 90% of Republicans in Congress would not say that he'd won. A tentative few appear to be ready to defang conspiracism. And I think that appear here is the operative word. 6 weeks after the election, Senate Majority Leader McConnell said on the Senate floor, the voters, the courts, and the states have all spoken. And after the Capitol attack on his chamber and on him personally, McConnell said the mob was fed lies. They were provoked by the president and other powerful people, and McConnell is said to be open to the case that these were impeachable offenses. I believe that he would not have spoken truth to conspiracy if Trump's coup had succeeded. Remember, McConnell had remained silent for years about the two big lies that justified violence, Trump's voter fraud obsession and Democrats' violent treason. And yesterday he voted to terminate the trial before it began. Still, I think that hope is warranted. In his inaugural address, Biden explained why. We must reject the culture in which facts themselves are manipulated and even manufactured, he said. And then he added something very important. Enough of us have to reclaim reality. Not everyone, just enough of us. There's a second path to reclaiming reality, and I call that enacting democracy. We've seen that conspiracism is elastic. There's no place it can't go. There's a Trojan horse at every gate. And we saw what this delegitimation of the institutions of democratic government meant. We saw institutions derailed. We saw institutions invented. We saw institutions hijacked. We saw institutions circumvented. Loyalists were placed in every agency. There's a term for this. It's Gleichschaltung. It says that the formal structure of an institution or organization remains intact, but that it's diverted from its purpose and directed to another, to kleptocracy, for example, or it ceases to function at all. Institutions derailed, invented, hijacked, and circumvented. This is the wreckage of normal order under the aegis of a compromised sense of reality and patent unconcern to govern, which has made more and more people judge democratic government to be ineffective and unworthy. And I think that conspiracism as it's evolved today is less an instrument of governing than a substitute for governing. Its culmination, as we've seen, is non-governing. Well, enacting democracy is an antidote. The Biden administration can correct a lot of this. It can ferret out loyalists embedded in agencies and return them to responsible civil servants. And competent government can re-legitimate some of the functions. Government can make progress on vaccination and on health and on economic recovery. But enacting a democracy means not only governing, it's also pedagogical. It means explaining step by step what the regular procedures are and why officials are doing what they do. And there's no long-term strategy to promise a short-term return to public health or political health. Enacting democracy, even if it's successful, will take patience, perseverance, and I think a great deal of political creativity. The third path to reclaiming reality runs through civil society. The vast array of voluntary groups and associations that we call civil society is the living world of pluralism. By its very existence, it's an answer to any claim to own reality. And it's the beating heart of democracy in America. I can give just a couple of little examples. What I call witnessing professionals, climate scientists, public health experts, doctors and nurses, business owners and unions stand up to conspiracy. Specialists in election law, immigration law, and much more work through a host of organizations like the ACLU to contain the effects of malignant policy stoked by conspiracism. There are all kinds of advocacy groups that educate, organizers who use both face-to-face mobilizing and new technology to encourage people to demonstrate how they reject twisted versions of reality. And let me mention Black Lives Matter here. It's the largest mass movement in American history, I think. It's multiracial and multi-generational. And last June, by a 28% margin, a majority of American voters supported the protests and their cause. And up to 76% agreed that African Americans face a lot of discrimination. And importantly, to my mind, in contrast to many earlier social movements, Black Lives Matter leaders recognize that grievances about injustice and protest politics must be linked to popular mobilization of voters, because reclaiming reality is going to begin and end in politics. Well, I'm going to end with this. Reality does bite back, and eventually conspiracists in power may be exiled from government by voters. Still, we've all seen the force of conspiracism, not least elected officials in a climate that's still rife with rage and people who determine to dispense with evidence and threaten violence. Hope is warranted, but uncertainty is warranted too. And I think the ultimate reason for that is that there's so much that we don't understand. Social scientists and historians have learned a lot about the historical origins of democratic legitimacy. And we're just learning about the delegitimation of stable democracies. But we're on our own when it comes to the relegitimation of democratic institutions. We just don't know much about it. We do know that it begins, as most things do, with understanding. And I think that reflecting on the absurdity and the danger of conspiracism is one, although only one, standpoint. For myself, I listen every day for what I take to be the sure note of democratic confidence. It's Tom Paine's note. It's the notes that struck whenever political common sense is invoked against malignant claims to own a nation by owning reality. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that talk. My name is Miyako, and I'm the club administrator for the ColumbiaDC Alumni Club here. So we have a good number of questions that are coming in already. We've sparked a lot of thought, I think. Go ahead and type your Q&As. If you still have questions, we'll get to as many as we can, and we'll go as close as we can to about 8 o'clock. So the first question that came in very early on, I think a lot of people kind of worry about this and think about it, is how does someone become receptive to these ideas? And some of us may think they're crazy, you know, they're nonsense, like, were they stupid? But so many people, millions of people are so receptive to this. And then we had another question come in. Kristen says she has intelligent friends and relatives who believe the election fraud conspiracies to be true. So one, I guess, how do you think people become receptive to them? And then two, to the second question is, how do we help those people, as she says, see the light and get them to see a different point of view?
Okay, I'd say that's a good question. And it's really a question that should be addressed to a psychologist, which I'm not. But I'm going to take a stab, and I'm going to say a couple of things. First of all, we know that belief in a conspiracy in conspiracies in general is extremely widespread. In fact, the psychologists who study this say that there's almost no one who doesn't believe in some sort of conspiracy theory, whether it's about the Kennedy assassination or the attack, the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, or whether it's aliens coming, and so on and so forth. So, and many of these conspiracies, and I've read a lot of them, are, you know, some of them are just entertaining. They're not too serious. And they're not even necessarily political. For example, there's one going around about how there are no birds anymore. What you see and think are birds are really drones. And that JFK was assassinated because he wanted to stop the drones that were killing the birds. So there's everything in the world out there. So it's not at all unusual for people to believe in a conspiracy theory. But I think that what your questioners are asking about is the political conspiracy theories that are dangerous and destructive and that we're seeing around us now. And one kind of answer is that if you have a conspiracist mindset, it can go a lot of places. It can go from the drones and the birds to a political conspiracy if the situation is right. And I think that it would be almost implausible to think that somebody who wasn't in some ways attracted to the extremism and populism of Trump would be a follower of some of his conspiracy claims, like rigged elections. So you begin with some sort of mindset that's open to conspiracism, and then some sort of political affinity. And not just political affinity, I want to say this too, there's a kind of emotional, as I've said before, a kind of emotional release that comes with believing some sort of really quite radical conspiracy theory, because it allows you to express aggression, it allows you to be quite emotional in these things. So there's both an emotional and a political counterpart. And then finally, and you know, your questioner who said, you know, she has family and friends who do this, I think it gives people what Trump allowed it to give people, because it doesn't by nature give people, is a collective political identity. You are part of a we. You are part of a powerful group that exhibits its power not only through social media and popular culture, but day after day in politics and what's going on. So it's very gratifying. I hope that answers it in part.
Yes, that's great. So we get a lot of questions coming in. I'm hoping we can get to most of them. I'm going to combine some of them. We had somebody ask, how can politics overcome this conspiracism when so many elected representatives are continuing to perpetuate these lies? And then kind of on the similar vein, that specifically on Marjorie Taylor Greene, that do you think she actually believes these conspiracies, or is she and others, but are they just doing it to, create chaos and try and seize power?
Let me start with the Marjorie Greene one. I have no doubt that many of the elected officials who are either silent in the face of conspiracism or are complicit in it do this cynically. They do it either because their constituents seem to require some sort of, accommodation to conspiracism, or because they fear that Trump or other powerful people in their party will primary them if they aren't submissive, and so on. So there's an awful lot of that, and I may come back to that in a second. But Marjorie Greene, I think, is not that. I think she is not just playing with her constituents. I think this is a woman who has a long history of this before she was a candidate for office. And I don't think that you can be as virulently attached to these very dangerous conspiracy accounts without believing it. That is to say, it could also be used cynically as a weapon, but it has to be combined with belief, and with more than what I described as it's true enough. I mean, she seems to really adopt these things in a vicious, vicious way. And there's all sorts of writing coming out in the last few days because she's been challenged by Kevin McCarthy about her history. So I think that's a sort of simple one. Yeah.
Well, is there any legal recourse for those kinds of politicians who are spreading, these lies, and some people may go out and be violent about it? So is there any way to act against them legally?
If she isn't literally inciting violence, then I don't think that there's legal recourse. She may have libeled people in the course of doing this, in which case there's civil suits that can be brought, the way the parents of the elementary school massacre have brought legal suits and really quite destroyed Alex Jones. Congress could take action against her. She could be censured. She could even be thrown out of Congress for doing things like saying that she wants to kill Democrats. She wants to shoot this Democrat in the head. But that's a political non-starter today. Given the Republican Party as it is. And the line that they're using, which is that we can't have division within the Congress, within the party in the Congress. So certainly political representatives, to go back to the first question, could and do under normal circumstances speak truth to their constituents and to their colleagues, but not under current circumstances. I mean, I've begun to document the most obvious and ordinary ways in which the Republican Party has become a Trumpist party, and which even McConnell, given his initial things, has now argued against having an impeachment trial. Because I believe because his caucus is much more radical than he is, and he has to follow, not lead, his caucus at this point.
So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the media and the role that media, both TV media and social media, have played in kind of, I don't know if radicalizing is the right word, but really continuing to put out these ideas Fox News being the big one, but then also social media like Facebook. I read recently a stat that said something like half of all groups that these radical people are joining on Facebook are because they were suggested to them, not that they found them by themselves. So what role is the media and social media playing in this?
Well, from the start of Trump's conspiracism, social media has been under scrutiny and really has been proffered as the principal explanation for all of this. It's first of all, it allows anybody to communicate with anyone for free without, until very recently, any kind of gatekeeping. It's especially suited to conspiracy without the theory, to the kind of conspiracism we have today, because you can say things very simply in a single word. You can say this thing was a hoax or this thing was rigged. And you can measure, this is important, you can measure that a lot of people are saying it, right? Just discarding the possibility of bots, you can actually tell. And the reportage on this has really been quite terrific, explaining how this happens. There's actually a Netflix piece called Social Media Out that tells how the algorithms, not even the people in charge, but the algorithms themselves keep exciting the most combustible material because it brings in clicks and it makes them money. So all of this is true. Having said that, there are a lot of people who study social media now, including people at the Berkman Center at Harvard Law School, who say that you shouldn't overemphasize the role of social media in all of this, that other media have played a part, that most people still get their news from local news and from local papers, not the New York Times, not the New York Post, and not the rags. And it is a problem that these local stations are now conglomerates owned by conservatives, right? And the same thing is true of local newspapers. I happen to live in a town where there's actually an independent local paper, but it's very rare these days. At any rate, they're pointing out that more people learn what they learn from anything else. And actually, I'll leave it at that. The mainstream media has been very slow to attack conspiracism. After a year or more of Trump, it began to do that. And the data has, until very recently, been quite mixed on whether, when you try to fact check or give the lie to conspiracism, whether simply the fact that you're repeating the conspiracist claim gives it more weight, right? Whether it isn't counterproductive to do that. Mm-hmm. More recently, it's found that there is a cumulative effect of speaking truth for people. And once again, it's not that you can convince die-hard conspiracists that they're wrong any more than you could, to use an analogy, take members of a cult and tell them that their guru is a fraud and making money off them. There may be one or two who will leave the cult and tell the story of what happened. But most passionate followers of conspiracism are doing it for their reasons and can't be persuaded. It's important. Speaking truth is important for the rest of the population that isn't so dug in. And it even gives heart to those of us who are trying to oppose it on our own.
And so, again, I'm going to combine a bunch of questions here to do what you can. But so we have somebody asking, how do we purge Trump and his co-conspirators from their sense of reality? But I think others are, trying to see if we put these fact checkers on Twitter and Facebook, like, this has been proven false, or here's a different article or whatever. Does that help at all, that kind of, fact checking, or does it just make people think that it's the deep state controlling everything? So how do we what can we do maybe to go against that idea of the media and what's true, what's not true? How do you determine?
Well, I'm going to repeat what I've said twice before already. I think that to focus your efforts on dissuading die-hard conspiracists that the election was rigged is impossible. And it's not necessary. This was the wisdom in what Joe Biden said. I mean, of all the things in his inaugural speech that this should stand out to me shows you how deeply I am into studying conspiracism, when he said, enough of us have to understand what fact and truth are. And I think that's the answer. You're not going to correct Trump, who's had a conspiracist mindset and a solipsistic sense of reality, probably from the time he was an adolescent. That's not going to change. But and you're only going to get those people who adhere to this cynically or out of fear to change how they behave and do they speak truth if you create political conditions that give them incentives to do that. And so, which is why I say that ultimately the change will have to come about through politics, that is through voters doing what they did last time, although only at the presidential level.
Right. We had a really interesting question. I'm trying to find it here. Laura is a psychiatric nurse practitioner. And she says, if you can speak to the idea that this national reality disorder is something that mental health professionals should be addressing, do you think there are dangers to referring to conspiracy theorists and propagators as mentally ill?
I don't think, that's a great question. And I'm sure, Laura, did you say her name was?
Laura.
I'm sure that Laura has seen the book written by about 50 psychiatrists, including my husband, called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, which they give analyses of him. So I don't think that that in treating people who are, and my psychiatrist friends say that they have many, many patients now who are, between COVID and everything else, who are extremely distressed by all of this. And I don't think that it's necessary to say that Trump or any other conspiracist or any other person is mentally disturbed. I don't think that's necessary. Laura would know better than I. I think the point is to appreciate that when we have a national reality disorder, that what they're experiencing is shared and why it is. And it is being shared because so much disinformation and very deep conspiracism has been thrown at us for years now, and it can be extremely disorienting. I'm an academic who studies these things, and I began this talk by talking about my disorientation with the idea that the photos were doctored. So I don't think you have to accuse other people of being deranged or mentally ill, even the people who are spreading this, but we do sometimes have collective disorders that come about because we have very real collective experiences of disorientation. So that would be my answer to Laura, who asked a really good question.
I think that a lot of us, I mean, you started this talking about the day after the inauguration with the crowd size, but I think a lot of us think that, or some of us think that these people have been out there forever. And they've just kind of been quiet, and they're just now coming out because they feel comfortable, and that these ideas are centuries old. Trump is just exploiting them. Do you have any thoughts on, I guess, on whether it's new, or is it just now that they're more vocal about it?
Well, it depends on what the it is. As I've said, we've always had conspiracy ideas and conspiracy theories, and of every kind. Conspiracism is as old as politics. So it's not that this is new. I think that there are a confluence of things that are bringing conspiracies out. And I have no doubt that we would not be having either the dimension of popular conspiracism that we have or its destructive effects if we didn't have a president who had a compromised sense of reality and who had the capacity to impose it on a nation. He had the capacity to express it at scale every day, and he had the capacity to make it true in the sense that he would, say somebody was a member of the deep state and turn an agency upside down. And when you see this going on, and when you're applauded for following him and appreciating his compromised sense of reality, then you will become active yourself. So it is an interaction. Trump didn't create conspiracism, and he didn't even create all of the conspiracists who follow him, but he did make it possible for this to be something that took over a political party and took over the American political life for 4 years and is ongoing.
Lawrence Nelson has a question that conspiracy or statement maybe that conspiracy isn't just one-sided, so it's not just the Republicans. And so he has some different examples just asking, like, you know, was the Trump-Russian collusion a conspiracy, or the Hunter Biden job Burisma? And like one more example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics that confirmed Trump's claim that Black and Hispanic unemployment was the lowest in levels in history. He said, is that a conspiracy?
Yes, Lawrence Nelson is asking a very fair question, given the talk that I just gave. And I would say 2 things. First of all, in modern history, conspiracy theory has come from the right and from the left. It has come from every political direction and sometimes aimed at the same targets. And so if you sort of, to add up the amount of conspiracy theory out there, I don't think the right has more of it than the left. I'm looking at what's happened over the last 5 years, or say, with a conspiracist in the White House who is a Republican. And I do think that if you look at this period of time, you'll find that there is a difference between Republican and Democrats when it comes to conspiracy. And it's where I began, although I didn't make the partisan point there then. So let me make it now. Lots of Democrats and left-wingers are conspiracy theorists. That is, they're classic conspiracy theorists. If you watch Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, she spent 2 years collecting every little bit of evidence she can to prove that Trump was a puppet or whatever of Putin, right? The left was very much engaged in conspiracy theory. The right created this new thing that I call conspiracism. That is conspiracy without the theory. I'll leave it at that. That is the without evidence, without argument, simply saying that we can politically identify ourselves and our enemies with a word by saying hoax, right? So they are not conspiracy theorists. I think as a general matter, it's fair to say that there is this divide in thinking about how you explain why things are not as they seem. And it comes from both the right and left, but they do it very differently. And it happens that it was a Republican in the presidency who was a conspiracist who has done the damage that I believe he's done to American democracy.
If we can take a step back, or a few steps back, and kind of look at things a little bit more globally or historically. So Cynthia Kemp says, are there any other countries that have policies that are more effective in dealing with conspiracy theories? And then we also have a few people, including Sam Salyer, who says, are there any historical analogies that you think are relevant in understanding our present political movement or moment?
There are countries, especially in the European Union, that do a lot more censoring of social media and anything that looks like this on social media. But there is conspiracism everywhere. We have fragile democracies where you wouldn't expect to have fragile democracies many places today. Although I think the United States has come closer than any to really having an undoing and destruction of our democracy. So I think that there are legal means that other countries use that may be more effective in controlling this. I'm agnostic on this. You know, I don't know what kind of gatekeeping could or should be used against conspiracism. And, you know, real incitement, threats of violence and so on are one thing, but often that's not what we're talking about. So I have to say that I'm troubled by it and I don't know what I think. On the historical analogies, I would say that one thing that's been peculiar about conspiracism in this moment where we are is that there hasn't been one big lie. Now, in the last year, the stolen election has become, and it's been called the one big lie, but it really hasn't characterized what's been going on here. That is, Trump's lies and his conspiracy claims about where you find the deep state and so on go everywhere. They go everywhere. That's why we found the kind of disintegration of these institutions being hijacked and circumvented and invented and so on that we have. I think that typically, if you look at Erdogan and his notion of a coup against him from inside the military, or historically the German stab in the back, there's been one big lie. And what we've had is this really confounding phenomenon of floods of lies, simple lies, lies that can be disproved, and so on and so forth, without, and here's the punchline of what I'm about to say, without any obvious political purpose, right? We had have in Erdogan a deliberate, concentrated, structured policy of authoritarianism. With Trump, we have had chaos. And people draw analogies to authoritarianism, and they show how what he could do could end up in fascism or something else. But nobody would think that this was that some ideology of that kind has dominated the last 5 years. It hasn't. It has been a kind of weird but effective attempt to own reality across every dimension.
We have a couple questions about race, and I'm not sure how to kind of touch on them both historically, or ethnicity. So Peter Sarani says, how would you characterize the anti-Semitism in Europe in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in terms of either conspiracy theory versus conspiracism? And then also on, I guess, race is there's a question if you've looked further back to Trump's backing of other conspiracy theories around Obama's birth certificate and like the Central Park jogger case, and if that kind of racism was used in his multiple lies to kind of build out his whole conspiracy theories.
Well, I don't think there's any question that that Trump's affinities were racist, also sexist, but racist and sexist. And he began with his anti-immigrant crusade, saying the migrants were, murderous and carried disease and so on and so forth. And that has been really his one strongly held and persistent belief. We haven't heard too much about it lately because he's been so concerned about COVID and the election, but I think that that's his core thought. And then you define then the political opposition as an enemy or as traitorous because they are abetting the devolution of America as a Christian or white nation and so on. So that I don't know if that's an answer, but there's no question that that it's the animating idea, if he has an animating idea between what he would do in politics and what it is to make America great again, is to placate, and he has from the very start, white nationalists.
Another question, I feel like it's always politics and religion. So here's our religion question is, can you explain the interplay between conspiracism and religion? From Frank Palmer.
Conspiracism and religion. No.
No.
No, I haven't really thought about that, Frank. So I hesitate to just babble about it. I mean, I do think that there is, if you look at QAnon, for example, which some people, just recently they've been called domestic terrorists, but until they've been called domestic terrorists in the last month, they were increasingly thought of as a religious group or even a cult. And I think that there is a kind of apocalyptic character to QAnon and to some of this conspiracism. And to the extent that a religion is apocalyptic, I think that there's that affinity. by which I mean an apocalyptic vision says that unless we take drastic measures, right, or to put it differently, we are going to wait for the storm, and then we are going to produce the apocalypse, which will cleanse us, right? This is a religious notion that I think has been, altered, but taken up in the sort of dynamic of some of these conspiracist groups, and QAnon is the most obvious. And one of the things that religious apocalypticism and political apocalypticism share is this notion that violence is virtuous, that violence is in the cause of virtue, right? You can't threaten, much less, have a religious war with anybody except to think that the cause is virtuous. I think that's what's interesting. And I think that's where I find some parallel between apocalyptic religion and conspiracism today.
And looking at the Hill and the White House today, we have an impeachment trial starting. Maybe. So we have a question on, do you think that impeachment will be helpful and corrective, or will it kind of just push people further into their views around the deep state? And I guess, given that we have people like Marjorie Greene who believe in QAnon and our followers and other kind of those conspiracy believers in Congress, they just got voted in. They're not being voted out. So how do we kind of deal with both of those realities at the same time?
Well, I think the impeachment trial is morally and politically necessary. I would concede that in the short run, it could aggravate political division. I don't think there's any question about it. It's going to happen, right away. As soon as the trial starts, it's going to be a partisan trial. It's going to be viewed that way. Nonetheless, I think that we've had a president who has done extraordinarily destructive things, and to have those documented and aired is important. Now, this isn't a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This doesn't aim at reconciliation, right? This aims at speaking truth, really. And you might, if you were really pessimistic, you might say, well, this impeachment trial is for posterity, right? Or it's to hold people to account, right? Including the victims who are also the jurors. Mm-hmm. Everybody's going to have to vote. You're going to have to say where you stand. And somebody said something interesting the other day, and I wonder what your questioner thinks of this when we talk about the impeachment trial. Do you think the outcome of the trial would be different if there was a secret ballot? Mm. That as we know now that it's going to fall along party lines with maybe, 5 or 6 or whatever Republicans voting for impeachment. What if it were a secret ballot? If it were a secret ballot, it would be very interesting because you get a real count of who was on the side of Trumpism. As it is, we're just going to get a partisan count, and we're not going to learn as much as we would otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier that some people are really holding on to these ideas, either conspiracy or QAnon, because it gives them a sense of community. And I know some white Americans or European Americans sometimes feel like they don't have an identity, whereas a lot of minorities do feel that they have that culture that they're a part of and that they have that built-in sense of community. So is there anything, somebody asks, what new kind of community or identities could we create that don't require conspiracy theories that might be able to replace that feel and community for them?
Well, I don't think any kind of community requires a conspiracy theory or conspiracism. I mean, I think that in politics today, when I say that Trumpists have formed themselves into a political identity, it's coming at a particular moment, and it's coming at a moment when very clearly the partisan identities available to them, Republican, whatever that meant, and Democrat, whatever piece of that alliance you were in, didn't satisfy. And we have this two-party system, and we had a Republican Party that was taken over. So it's giving them, in the short run and immediately for very peculiar political circumstances, a political identity. I don't think, you know, there was a book written a while ago that said, demography is destiny, right? And it said that the Democratic Party was going to become the clear majority party because minorities of different kind who had community in this political identity were going to vote Democratic. I think we are beginning to see that that's not true. I mean, even under these circumstances, you had a rise in the number of Blacks and Hispanics who voted for Trump. And I think we shouldn't be surprised as Americans that that's true, because what we have here, slowly in some situations, more rapidly in others, is intermarriage. And by the second or third generation, people's identities are no longer just the demographically defined political identities that we expect. So so, you know, people thought the Democratic Party is on its way, right? It can't miss. And I would warn people that that's not true.
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially the more that we get couples intermarrying from different races, that it does get watered down. So very, very interesting point I'm going to think about more later. So we have people, you know, a lot of our events are very thought-provoking, but everybody wants to do something about it. So we have people asking at a bunch of different levels. So if you had tons of money, what would you give money to? You know, we're all alumni from different very well-known universities. What can universities do, or what can I do in my own neighborhood? So what can we do to either help people, our family members and friends that some people mentioned, or just move on kind of from these conspiracies if we can't change their minds?
Well,
sorry, that's like a lot of levels all in one question.
Right. Well, to tell you that, I shouldn't say this when I'm speaking to an alumni group, but I wouldn't put my efforts, first of all, into alumni associations or the universities. I think that Columbia and Harvard are good liberal universities, and conspiracism isn't rife there. And I don't think you're going to solve the problem there. I mean, I think these are universities that have great studies of ethics and politics, and, you know, great law schools, and that, I don't think that's where the problem lies, and I don't think that's where the solution lies. But there are all kinds of advocacy groups, I mean, civil society groups that do, you know, political or quasi-political work, and you can support candidates through either work or money. I mean, I think that the Democratic Party won this election, not by the skin of its teeth, but it won a presidential election, but it lost congressional elections, and it did not appreciably increase its standing in the state legislatures. And this is extremely important. That's where districting goes on. That's where the electoral business of democracy is carried out or not carried out, and is corrupted, as the case may be. So, you know, think about becoming either active in state and local politics, or supporting reasonable, rational, it doesn't have to be democratic, but reasonable, rational candidates.
And if you could give us, where can we look to read more, watch more? It could be documentaries, like you mentioned on Netflix, or podcasts, books, journalists, any books you want to promote. You know, tell us where to go to continue this conversation and learn more.
It's hard not to find it these days. So, you know, if you read a major newspaper like the New York Times and Washington Post, you will read a lot about it already. I should promote the book that I wrote with my Dartmouth colleague. It's called A Lot of People Are Saying: The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy. And it's one of many good books now on conspiracism from the point of view of cognitive science, from the point of view of political psychology. And ours really is from the point of view of the political theory of democracy.
And do you have any closing thoughts for us in our last couple of minutes?
No, I have loved this exchange. I only wish I could have heard the voices and had some dialogue, because I would have, wanted to go further with people. But it's been interesting, and I hope it was illuminating for you. And I wish us all well.
Thank you so much.
Professor Rosenblum, thank you so much for sharing your valuable time. And I know there's a lot of demand on your schedule. I just want to let everybody know that the recording of this session after processing will be shared with everyone within 24 hours. And we hope to have you, Professor, maybe in person, if this conspiracy that they say is a COVID would disappear. Hopefully we go back to in person.
Someday that will happen. And you'll send me the link?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed this immensely.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Good night.
Good night.